Hi guys, Claudia here, and today we're going to talk about the 15th of May, 1536. So today is one of the big ones. On the 15th of May, both Anne and George were put to trial. This took place in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. Now, because Anne and George are aristocracy because they're in such a high position, they are entitled to be tried by a jury of 26 of their peers. So although Henry's tried to keep this quiet up until this point, this is going to be quite a public trial for the both of them. They actually built a scaffold for about 2,000 spectators. So the idea behind this is that public opinion is already starting to turn towards Anne and George and feeling pity for them. Henry wants to appear merciful and like he's doing this by the book. Although Henry has treated Anne very unfairly, he doesn't want people to know that he's been doing that. I've spoken to you before about how important Henry VIII's reputation was to him, so it's so vital to him that he's still loved by the people, that he comes across as generous and merciful, and most of all, like he's the wronged party. So we have the Duke of Norfolk, who is the Lord High Steward, presiding over these trials. This is Anne and George's uncle. Now we know that he did not get on with Anne, and that he had something to do with the fall of Anne and George. It seems that he switched sides when he felt that the favour was turning. This is something that we're going to see from him a lot in the future as well. But him taking this position might have been something that he was compelled to do to prove his loyalty to the king. However much he disliked Anne and George, this is not going to be a pleasant situation for him. At the end of the day, this is his niece, this is his nephew, these are his little sister's children. The Duke of Norfolk is going to read out Anne's guilty verdict, and when he does that, people report that tears roll down his cheeks. So I personally think this shows that he isn't entirely cold-hearted. Some people have said that these are crocodile tears, but I actually think that however much you dislike someone, the actual reality of them being sentenced to death and knowing that you have something to do with them going to die, I think that's quite different. And we know that the Duke of Norfolk had worked quite closely with George up until 1535. Claire Cherry and Claire Ridgway tell us that he's been on 2 embassies to France with George. And I actually think this brings home the human level of this event. You know, this isn't just a story, these are real people. This is a man that disliked Anne, was an enemy of Anne's, and yet he cries when she's sentenced because of the injustice of it. This is a notoriously hard and ruthless man, but people are complex, and he is the man who is sentencing his little sister's children to death. I think even if he is this unsavoury character, the tears were probably still real. There are some differing accounts of this, but Claire Cherry and Claire Ridgway write in George Boleyn, Tudor Poet, Courtier and Diplomat, that Anne is actually tried first. And this is because of the guilty verdict given to the other men. They've been found guilty of adultery with the Queen, so there's no real way that Anne can be found innocent. Now, the 3 women that gave evidence to Cromwell, supposedly, do not appear at this trial. Now, this could be because this evidence is made up. It could be because it's so flimsy and Anne is such a good speaker that they don't want to risk putting them on the stand, because Anne would be able to refute the allegations. Henry Percy of Northumberland, who is the man that Anne was romantically linked to before she was romantically involved with Henry VIII, that's who I spoke to you about yesterday, he has to be one of the peers on the jury. So this is a horrific situation with him, because this is the woman that we suppose he once loved. He now knows that he is probably going to have to find her guilty in order to protect his own position. And again, most, if not all of these men are probably aware of Anne's innocence. Now, it was initially reported that Thomas Boleyn, George and Anne's father, was present at the trials, but that's since been refuted. So it seems that since the arrests of his 2 youngest children, Thomas Boleyn has kept his head down as much as possible. Some people have judged it as cowardly that he didn't stand up for them and that he didn't show himself at court, that he seemed to want to protect himself and his reputation. But other people view him as a broken man who is seeing this horrific thing happening to his children, and he's someone that doesn't want to have to be there when his kids are being sentenced to death for something that they didn't do. So the Thomas Boleyn of fiction is often portrayed as weak or cowardly, or sometimes as a pushy manipulator who pushes Anne into the spotlight and then completely abandons her. But there's nothing to tell us that Thomas Boleyn was a cold father. Anne and George obviously respected him because they took on many of his reformist views. Thomas always did his best for George and Anne. He got them the best appointments he could. He got Anne the place in the Netherlands for her early education. George is is appearing at court very young. This is a father who is working extremely hard for his children. And remember, Tudor fatherhood is quite different from the parenting that we see today. It might seem more distant, but Tudor parents would show their love by trying to secure the very best futures and positions they could for their children. Some people say that he played his part in pushing Anne towards the king, but actually what we know is that he sent Anne back to the family home of Hever Castle in Kent when the king was pursuing her, which is most likely because he wanted to protect her from the king's advances. Anne's older sister Mary had obviously been a mistress of Henry VIII, and she hadn't come out of it well at all, so this seems to be Thomas protecting his younger daughter. I just don't think there's any way to judge Thomas Boleyn's motives and emotions here because we just don't have the sources. We don't know why he wasn't present. Remember again that this is not a fair trial, and everyone involved knows pretty much that Anne and George are going to be found guilty. So this isn't a real trial, this is their death sentence. So as I've said, Anne's trial is first, and she's not even allowed to see George. She won't have passed him, she won't have glimpsed him. It seems like the last time Anne ever saw her brother was on either the 1st of May at the May Day joust or on the 2nd of May, before George went to the king to try and intercede on her behalf. So Anne is brought into the room by two ladies, Master Kingston's wife, Lady Kingston, and one of her aunts called Lady Boleyn. They've set a chair up for her on the platform, and she is said to walk to it with great dignity and sit down. Joanna Denny tells us that Anne had nobody on the case for defence. She had nobody to support her, she had no lawyers. She had to do this on her own. In contrast, she is facing benches of the prosecution. Cromwell has assembled an extremely ruthless and hostile group against her. Bear in mind, Anne does not even know the full charges yet. So the trial begins by them reading Anne the indictment. So we've already gone through these together. We went through the Middlesex indictment and the Kent indictment. So this is the first time that Anne's actually heard these charges properly. Already she's at a disadvantage because this is all new to her. So Eustace Chapuis later describes this scene to the Emperor in a letter, and he says, "What she was principally charged with was having cohabited with her brother and other accomplices, and that there was a promise between her and Norris to marry after the king's death, which it thus appeared they hoped for, and that she had received and given to Norris certain medals, which might be interpreted to mean that she had poisoned the late queen, and intended to do the same to the Princess Mary. These things she totally denied, and gave to each a plausible answer." So even Chapuis, who is one of Anne's enemies, who has no loyalty to her whatsoever, is saying that she managed to give plausible, reasonable answers to all the charges. So as I said, the three women that supposedly gave evidence against Anne did not appear. Something that came up in trial was a story about Lady Wingfield. So she was one of the Queen's ladies who is now dead, conveniently. Apparently on her deathbed, she told of the Queen's promiscuous ways. Now, she's dead and can't testify, and this means that Anne can't really refute this. Again, these are alleged words, and it seems unlikely that, first of all, that would be on her mind when she was dying, and second, that Anne's friend would do that to the Queen. Listen to this description by Joanna Denny of Anne at trial. "The Queen was of excellent quick wit, and being a ready speaker, she did so answer all objections. It was said that she was like an oak withstanding fierce storms. She spoke with such conviction that the whole chamber could not help but be convinced of her innocence." Wriothesley wrote of her, "She made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with words so clearly, as though she had never been faulty to the same." So the full details of what was said do not exist to us. If there was a document, it is now gone, it's been got rid of. But it would seem that the spectators watching were now convinced of her innocence because she spoke so well. Remember that both Anne and George are excellent speakers, they're extremely articulate, they're very confident speaking in public. They're really not the easiest people to get rid of in this respect, because they are so intelligent, they are so quick-witted. And what we know of them is that they were also bold, so they were bold enough to argue their cases. A lot of people would have crumbled under that pressure, but we know that the Boleyn siblings did not. Now, despite the spectators thinking that Anne must surely be freed after this, the jury don't take long to find her guilty. So Uncle Norfolk has to read her sentence, and this is when the tears start streaming down his face. He read, "Because thou hast offended our sovereign, the king's grace, in committing treason against his person, and here attainted of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death, and thy judgment is this, that thou shalt be burnt here within the Tower of London on the green, else to have thy head smitten off, as the king's pleasure shall be further known of the same. As horrific as that is a threat in itself, because it is still within the king's power to decide if Anne gets a quick death or if she gets an agonising death being burned at the stake. Judging by what we've seen from Henry before, I think this is a warning to Anne not to keep fighting her case now. So Anne would have expected that this was the likely outcome, but it was still a huge shock for her because remember, Henry had once loved her, he pursued her for years, he broke with the church so that he could marry her. This is especially cold and ruthless even for him, and I think deep down she must have hoped that he would show her mercy, that he would see sense when she defended herself. And of course, thinking you're going to be found guilty is very different from the reality of actually hearing them read out your death sentence. That makes it so real. This is not just an annulment and not just being replaced. She is going to be murdered. Henry is not only tired of her, but he now hates her. So although Anne stays quite composed, her emotions do start to break through more here. She's realising that she's not going to see Elizabeth, her daughter, again. She's not ever going to see George again. George is probably going to also be sentenced to death alongside her. She is going to be the first Queen of England to be put to death, and she might be burned at the stake. So this is what she says, and this causes great upset in the hall, who feel a lot of pity for her. O Father, O Creator, thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, knowest that I have not deserved this death. My lords, I do not say that my opinion ought to be preferred to your judgment, but if you have reasons to justify it, there must be other than those which have been produced in court, for I am wholly innocent of all the matters of which I have been accused, so that I cannot call upon God to pardon me. I have always been faithful to the king, my lord, but perhaps I have not always shown to him such a perfect humility and reverence as his graciousness and courtesy deserved, and the honour he hath done me required. I confess that I have often had jealous fancies against him, which I had not wisdom or strength enough to repress. But God knows that I have not otherwise trespassed against him. Do not think I say this in the hope of prolonging my life, for he who saveth from death has taught me how to die, and will strengthen my faith. Think not, however, that I am so bewildered in mind that I do not care to vindicate my innocence. I knew that it would avail me little to defend it at the last moment, if I had not maintained it all my life long, as much as ever queen did. Still, the last words of my mouth shall justify my honour. As for my brother, and the other gentlemen who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly die to save them, but as that is not the king's pleasure, I shall accompany them in death. And then afterwards I shall live in eternal peace and joy without end, where I will pray to God for the king and for you, my lords. So Decazes tells us that Anne's speech really upset the audience, and Chapuis tells us that she added this: the judge of all the world, in whom abounds justice and truth, knows all, and through his love I beseech that he will have compassion on those who have condemned me to this death. Even Chapuis here, who has been one of Anne's enemies, who has helped in constructing the case, who has wanted her brought down, is now coming to terms with the fact that she's probably innocent. He starts feeling sorry for her. Now Henry Percy, who had once been in love with Anne, collapses, and he has to be carried out of the room, and he will never recover from this event. He is going to die the following year. He is so distressed by this that he is not present at George's trial after Anne's. The Lord Mayor of London says about the trial, I can only observe one thing in this trial: the fixed resolution to get rid of the Queen at any price. And even Cromwell is later going to praise the spirit of the Boleyns. So Anne is taken back to her quarters in the Tower, and now it is George's turn. Now George is dealing with this slightly differently to Anne. George is righteous, he's charismatic, he is going into this all guns blazing. So the siblings seem to be having something of a personality switch here, because George was known in life to be more easygoing than Anne, and people seem to get on with him better. Anne was known more as the outspoken troublemaker of the pair, although of course we can't look at that without thinking about Tudor gender roles and how a woman who is assertive or outspoken or intelligent would have been considered as a troublemaker, so we can't be completely convinced by that. But it certainly seems that Anne is the one who is more prone in life to outbursts of emotion, outbursts of temper and upset. George is usually the one that calms her down. But in this instance, Anne is quite calm at her trial, she's quite dignified. George is angry, there's an injustice here and he wants to fight it. George knows he's going to be put to death, but he also knows that this is probably going to be his last opportunity to speak in public. So the point of him speaking now is not to save his life or to save Anne's life, it's to protect his honour and his reputation. He also wants the spectators watching to know that the king and Cromwell have engineered this conspiracy. So I'm going to refer quite heavily now to this book, George Boleyn, Tudor Poet, Courtier and Diplomat by Claire Cherry and Claire Ridgway. I cannot recommend this book enough. It has got such in-depth information about George. They've done so much research on him. So according to Charles Wriothesley, who also made comment on Anne's trial, he described how George made answers so prudently and wisely to all articles laid against him that marvel it was to hear, and never would confess anything, but made himself as clear as though he had never offended. Lancelot de Cars suggests that even Thomas More could not have replied better than George did during his trial. And this really shouldn't surprise us because we know that George is an excellent speaker in public. Now, people were so convinced that after George's fantastic appearance in court, he would be found innocent and freed. They were even taking odds on it. They were making bets saying that he would be freed. Now, this situation is an absolute nightmare for the king and for Cromwell. They have dreaded the day that George Boleyn took the stand because George is so clever, he's so charismatic, he's so quick-witted. This public trial has majorly backfired. The Boleyns have now got the public on their side, the public pity them. I'm sure that Cromwell and the king probably ended up regretting giving Anne and George the opportunity to have these public trials. Now, George Boleyn, Jane's wife, is not in attendance, so like the rest of Anne's ladies, she has been questioned, and she has given one piece of information which is used here at the trial. Once, Anne is said to have confided in her about the king's impotence. That's where the line from Six the Musical comes from, by the way. You know that I wouldn't be such a if you could get it up. That's essentially what that's referring to. Now, because Jane's not in attendance, we don't know how true this is. But again, this is not a crime. This would have been Anne confiding in one of her ladies and probably one of her friends. But it's used in George's trial because he is accused of spreading this rumour around the court. And this comment about the king's apparent impotence, which we know if it was true was not a permanent issue for him, is being used to explain why Anne would have turned to different lovers and committed incest with George. Now, we've spoken about this before. This is not really in George's interest to do this, so it's unlikely that he did. Now, Eustace Chapuis gives us an account of this part of the trial, and I absolutely love this. I think this is the best clue we have as to George's personality. Now, of course, the idea of the king being impotent would be considered extremely embarrassing. So this allegation was written on a piece of paper and given to George with the instruction from Cromwell that he was not to read it aloud, he was just to read it to himself. So this is what Chapuis says. I must not omit that among other things charged against him as a crime was that his sister had told his wife that the king was impotent. This he was not openly charged with, but it was shown to him in writing, with a warning not to repeat it. But he immediately declared the matter in great contempt of Cromwell and some others, saying that he would not in this point arouse any suspicion which might prejudice the king's issue. So this is George hitting back where he can. He's obviously angry with the king. The king is putting his friends to death, he's putting his sister to death, he's going to put George to death. There isn't much that George can do, but he's clever enough that he uses this mistake to accidentally tell everyone listening that the king may be impotent. And this is also him telling Cromwell that yes, he might be put in the tower, he might be put to death, but Cromwell does not control him. But this is also very clever from George, because he says here that he would not in this point arouse any suspicion which might prejudice the king's issue. So these impotency issues were supposed to have happened after Elizabeth was born. So Elizabeth is safe from that allegation. What George is basically doing is now casting a shadow over any future heirs the king might have with Jane. If the king is impotent, he is implying that if Jane is to have any children by the king, then how can they be the king's children? And in this way, he is not only insulting the king, but he's also protecting his niece Elizabeth. Now, as to the incest charge, Chapuis tells us, no proof of George's guilt was produced. except that of his having once passed many hours in her company and other little follies. So the only evidence they are able to bring against George on these incest charges is the evidence of past times in the Queen's chamber, so that means that sometimes he would be alone with Anne in her room. Now obviously, seeing as he is her brother and her friend, this is not an unusual thing to have happened, and I wish there was a way of witnessing this moment of George answering these accusations, because at this point in the trial you can tell he has had enough. He's already cleverly insulted the king, he's disobeyed Cromwell. One of George's worst traits is that he's known to be quite arrogant sometimes, especially when it can come to confrontation. Now especially in this situation where there's no evidence against him, I would really love to have seen him going off at them on this. Other things the prosecutors brought up were that apparently George and Anne had laughed at the king's poetry together and been caught laughing at the king's fashion sense. And this is being brought out as if it's an offence worthy of death. And as you'll know if you have siblings of your own, siblings do that. I hope nobody ever reads the messages that Dan and I send each other, because people get roasted all the time. The prosecution say that George led Anne in a dance, and that when Anne was pregnant, she wrote to George to tell him. And I don't even know how even in the Tudor era, they've tried to twist that to make it suspicious, because even to the audience listening then, that would have seemed totally normal. I mean, if I ever get pregnant at some point, I'm pretty sure that somewhere down the line, I will inform my brother that he's going to become an uncle. Now, there aren't even any eyewitnesses to say that George and Anne had been caught laughing, and there's certainly no eyewitnesses for anything at all inappropriate. Remember, the full extent of these incest charges are that George was alone with Anne in her room sometimes. And again, we know how close they were, we know that they were good friends, they read the same books, they were both reformers, they had the same circle of friends. This is not at all suspicious. And this will have been going on throughout the whole time that Henry knew Anne. It only becomes suspicious to him when he has another woman that he wants to replace her with. Funny that. Now, Claire Ridgway and Claire Cherry, who wrote the George Boleyn book, say that even if Anne and George had laughed at the king, and I'm sure they probably did, it's likely that if it happened in public, this was a jest, it was banter, a shared joke. And that's probably true. But even if they had done that in public, which I don't particularly think they would have, that is not an offence worthy of death. Now, because this is a public trial, word is going to start to get around about how well George answered these accusations. Now, up until this point, all these rumours have been swirling, and people have assumed, because they think that Henry VIII is probably a good man who's been wronged by his wife, they assume that there must be some sort of evidence against George that they didn't know about. Now they're starting to realise that there is no evidence. So again, this is the first time that the public are really starting to realise that Henry VIII is a bit of a tyrant. Now, of course, George is found guilty, and it is the Duke of Norfolk who reads the sentence again. The Duke of Norfolk says that he should go again to prison in the Tower, from whence he came, and to be drawn from the said Tower of London through the City of London to the place of execution called Tyburn, and there to be hanged, being alive cut down, and then his members cut off, and his bowels taken out of his body, and brent, which means burned, before him, and then his head cut off, and his body to be divided into 4 pieces, and his head and body to be set at such places as the king should assign. Now, this is an absolutely horrific thing for George to hear, but he did expect this, so he doesn't crumble. So apparently he stays quite calm. He says that all men are sinners and thus deserving of death. So this is a common religious view, and it's the idea of original sin. But again, him saying this is clever because he's not saying that he's guilty of the charges, he's saying that he supposes he's guilty as all men are guilty, as innocent men are guilty in the eyes of God. He also says that if the law has found him guilty, then he will no longer try and fight for his innocence. Again, he's saying if the law has found him guilty, he's not saying he is guilty. George knows that he has no real power in this, he's pushed as far as he can, and it's also now up to the king, in his mercy, to decide the method of George's execution. Obviously, like Anne, who doesn't want to be burned at the stake, George does not want to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Thankfully, both of them are beheaded, which is a quick death. But I think George realises here that he's done all he can. All he can do now is accept it, because he can't change anything. So George also asks the king to please pay his debts, because as he's in the Tower of London and all his property and wealth are being taken from him, he can't pay the people that he owes money. George is then taken back to his room in the Tower, just the same as Anne before him, George is going to be executed 2 days from now. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you're staying safe. On the 19th, on Anne's death day, I'm actually going to be releasing to you a single that I have written with another artist called Tudor Acid, and it's dedicated to Anne, so I'm excited to play that to you on the 19th. I hope you're still enjoying this series, as horrible a subject as it is. I love you loads, and I will see you really soon. Bye!